Hello and welcome to one of your videos on alternative building materials, and in this case we're talking about hempcrete. So what is hempcrete? Well, it's primarily used either as a block material or as an infill material that's sort of poured and packed into walls. Hempcrete got its start around the 1990s, and it was actually because of in Belgium and France they had a lot of these beautiful old half timber houses where the plaster that's in between the timber is made of horsehair plaster and straw plaster, but the problem is they were degrading, and as they degraded they needed a way to repair these, and they didn't want to use typical plaster today. They didn't want to go back to the horsehair plaster, so they tried this new method of hemp lime construction where they replace a significant portion, if not all, of the sand that's mixed with the lime plaster instead with hemp, but specifically hemp sheaves or hemp hurds, which are just chopped up parts of the hemp plant stock. And of course, hemp's now not just used for repairing old 1600s and Renaissance buildings. Instead, it can also be used in modern construction today as that infill material or even an exterior or interior finish. So what exactly is hemp made of? So hemp is grown for its fibers. It is in the same family as marijuana. They're both part of the cannabis family, but they're completely different plants. So even though marijuana and hemp have similar leaf shapes as seen in the upper photos, the marijuana plant actually has very high concentrations of the chemical THC, which is known to create that altered state, up to like 20% THC, versus the hemp plant, which may only have 1% of the THC. And in fact, to legally grow hemp in Canada, your plants cannot produce more than 0.3% THC. Now, this distinct variety of the cannabis can be anywhere from 4 to 15 feet tall and up to 3/4 of an inch diameter. And then what happens, and we can see in this center photo, we have this open area where it's hollow, but then we have this inner area here, which is like a pith, say on a tree, but this pith is known as the hurd or the sheave. And then you have these woody fibers on the outside, known as the bast, and they're connected to the core, the inside, with this glue-like pectin substance. Now the outside fibers, the bast fibers, are used in your textiles, cordage, fine paper products. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. But the core fiber is typically just then ground up and used for animal bedding, garden mulch, fuel, and now this possible building material. But there are some issues that can come with hemp as a building material. So let's watch some few clips from this short video about using hemp as an infill material.
After 3 weeks of drying, it looks like the mix we used with only 9 litres of water, with the much drier mix, hasn't bound together properly. And if you touch the wall, large sections can just flake away. This is in substantial difference to the wetter mix, where if you touch it and you rub your hand along it, nothing really comes off the wall. We also did at the top of this wall a slightly wetter mix which used 10 litres of water, and if you brush that, some material comes away, but not nearly as much as the mix we used with only 9 litres of water. It appears that this is not just an isolated problem, as all along the wall, wherever we brush it, large amounts of hemp are just sort of falling out. This is the really dry mix. You can see how at the top, I just rub my hand along and it's just all completely crumbling away. Underneath the windowsill, the hemp is extremely flaky. We're very concerned that the render wouldn't stick to this, and the windowsill would be a particularly vulnerable point. The section above where a spacer was, again, just crumbling away with only a very light touch. This is in contrast to the wetter mixes we've done where you get a tiny little bit flaking off, but really it's very hard and firm right up to that top layer.
and the unstable hempcrete had to be removed. Let's head back to our slides. And so some key things to notice from that video is that the hempcrete was being used as an infill material, but they talked about it was around the windowsill and they wanted to come back with some sort of render. So they're probably talking about a clay plaster or a lime plaster that it would put on the walls. It would stick very nicely to that rough hempcrete surface, and then you'd have a nice finished material. But if that hempcrete surface is falling apart, you're going to get cracks in your plaster, which then will allow for things like moisture inclusion or whatnot, and then that could be a huge problem, especially around a window. Now, some ways that hemp are used is not only the way we saw in the video where it's just going to be, packed in wet. A cool thing about hemp is that you can also spray it. So much like a shotcrete concrete, you can spray on the hempcrete and get it nice and compacted on a surface to have as your exterior surface. It's used internally, either, as we've seen already, as insulation. So here's two examples of it being used in between the walls. And then here actually are folks who are promoting its use more as just an interior finish of something of interest and unique. You can add colors to the mixes and get some really fun things, much like rammed earth. But one of the things you have to be very careful is noting that it's just been used as infill or decorative. It is not a structural material. In fact, if you can even get 1 megapascal of strength out of this stuff, that's a big deal. It is not strong. It's just a good infill. And one of the reasons it's such a great infill is because it is a phenomenal insulator. If we were to look at pricing for our hemp HURDS from the American Hemp Incorporated, you can see a single bag is going to cost you about $23. The bag is 5 cubic feet though, so that's a pretty decent amount. A double bag, 10 cubic feet, $42. And so here's some basic pricing. And if we were to break out what it might cost to build a wall, if you were to buy a bag of hydrated lime, because you're going to mix your hemp with lime, it'd be $12.50. You typically do a 2-to-1 ratio. 200 pounds of lime for 100 pounds of hemp. So breaking it out, 4 bags of lime, 3 bags of hemp, cost your material $119 for 15 cubic feet of wall. And so basically what that ends up with is that your hempcrete wall costs about $8 a square foot to fill in between your wood studs, but you get an R value of more than 30 and a very, very airtight system, so you don't get a lot of leakage. If we went with a standard drywall wall where you have insulation in between, you might do a bat of R15, maybe even just R13, but we'll say you went big and went R15. So you have $40 for your insulation, you have $10 per sheet of drywall. So we break it out per square foot and we're going to get $10 a square foot, but we're only getting R15 insulation, and that's only between the studs. Your studs are only giving you an R value of about 7.5, and then there's a lot of gaps in that system. And so you're actually getting a more robust wall at less cost out of the hemp HURDS. And the amazing thing is if we look at the carbon content, so while 220 kilograms of lime binder is going to give you 94 kilograms of carbon dioxide emitted, the hemp HURD is actually sequestering 202 kilograms. So you end up with 108 kilograms of sequestered carbon in your wall. So that's a big deal. And one might say, well, why aren't we using this then all the time? In fact, why did we move away? If we can make clothing out of hemp and we can make rope out of hemp, well, let me tell you a little history about hemp. So hemp actually has a really long history in the United States. For centuries, it was grown for its fibers to be used in ropes and ship sails. In 1619, British colonists here in the U.S. were required to grow hemp under laws passed by Virginia, the Virginia Assembly, and hemp was actually accepted as legal tender, money, in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. George Washington himself grew hemp, and Jefferson did bioengineering to improve the crops. Early drafts of the Declaration of Independence were written on hemp paper. This demand for hemp continued until the later 1800s, where there started to be a decrease in demand, with a significant drop occurring after World War I. This was really linked to the steam and combustion powered ships that didn't need a lot of ropes and sails. And then in 1937, there was an additional drop because there became a Marijuana Tax Act that required hemp farmers to actually pay a tax. It wasn't huge. It would have been about $800 in today's dollars. But amazingly, during World War II, there was then a big push for farmers to actually grow hemp. In fact, there were hemp for victory posters and signs and advertisements because the Army needed the hemp fabrics and the robes. And so production of hemp significantly increased again until the war ended. And it was actually the advent of synthetic fibers, so your nylons and your polyesters, that really killed hemp, which is a shame because it's a great rotation crop. It can be harvested in as little as 90 days to 6 months and requires little water, no pesticides, and small amounts of nitrogen in case you don't have a nitrogen-rich soil. And what really got it pushed out was actually DuPont led the charge and created all sorts of documentation that advertised hemp as its cousin marijuana and that it was something that was harmful. And so that, as we now know, the hemp plant does not have the THC chemical in any sort of concentrations that can cause any sort of mind alteration, but is rather almost like a miracle fabric. It doesn't shrink like cotton. It creates very nice fabric materials. You can buy hemp clothing today. In 2014, the US government passed a pilot program that allowed growing of hemp by American farmers, and in 2018, it was passed into law that you could grow hemp in the United States, of course, having to have the THC at 0.3% or lower. Now, just because the federal government approved it does not mean that it is approved in all states, and currently in 47 out of the 50 states, you are able to grow hemp as a farmer. But it's not a cash crop yet. So this is your introduction to hempcrete. It is not a structural material at this point. There are people who are hoping to find a way to turn it into one, but there'll be a lot of research required. Thanks for watching.